So you are my former lives. Reflections of the good old days.
The mask is off. The game is over.
I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
We're not in Kansas anymore.
Don't you cry no more.
If there is one phrase that embodies the testing stage of the 2020s, it is, there is no place like home.
There's no place like home.
This was quite literal, even in the very beginning of the decade. The intersection between depression and testing is quite possibly the lowest point of the cycle. No one wants to be here, and it makes one long for another world, somewhere over the rainbow.
Somewhere over the rainbow.
You might be wondering why I am referencing The Wizard of Oz, a film that's over 80 years old, in a video about the 2020s. Well, I'm convinced that this stages of grief cycle has repeated several times throughout history. I believe that the previous testing stage was the 1940s. I haven't quite developed a full theory for this previous cycle yet, but I believe that the last shock stage was the 1890s. Denial was the 1900s. Anger was the 1910s. Bargaining was the Roaring 20s. The Great Depression was the 1930s. And finally, testing was the 1940s. It is easy to see how the 1940s was a dark time, as it was World War II, and the events that took place in this decade created a new world order that has ruled ever since. The testing stage is a decisive moment where we will test new solutions with varying degrees of success. America won World War II and became the new global hegemon. I believe that this power has been in decline for some time now, and that whatever transpires in the 2020s will create a new superpower, a new victor that creates a new regime. So when I say that we aren't in Kansas anymore, I mean that literally as well. The American world that we were born into is one that we no longer live in. The Wizard of Oz was released in 1939, pretty much the 1940s, and I believe it is a testing-themed work of art. The old power structure is revealed. We see the man behind the curtain.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. The great Oz has spoken.
Who are you?
Oh, I am the great and powerful Wizard of Oz.
You are? I don't believe you.
We are no longer threatened by or believe in the propaganda of this regime. And this old order is defeated. Ding dong, the witch is dead.
Ding dong, the witch is dead. Ding dong, the wicked witch is dead.
Given that we are only in 2024, we still have more than half of this decade ahead of us, and the few years that we have already lived through are so brand new to us that there is no work of art that I could have picked that would have sufficed. So I thought I'd look back to the previous cycle and pick a work of testing art that everyone would be somewhat familiar with. However, the genre of fiction that I would associate with the 2020s is the multiverse. The testing stage is partly defined by being a sort of collage of all the past decades put together. As I wrote this, it hit me that even my own series is a work of testing media. If the Depression era was about self-reflection, testing is all about collective reflection, looking at all the achievements as well as all the flaws of our own culture up to this point. I recently played through a video game called Astrobot, and it's the first time I went into a video game while keeping this theory in mind as I was playing. it struck me how many references were in the game. Astrobot is a PlayStation game about PlayStation games. It is pretty meta. I got to see Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Cole McGrath from Infamous, Wander from Shadow of the Colossus, Joel and Ellie from The Last of Us, Sackboy from Little Big Planet, and the Maiden in Black from Demon's Souls. The game itself is a celebration of gaming, a compilation of PlayStation itself. The ending of Astrobot also struck me as significant. After the final boss, Astrobot becomes disassembled and you have to reassemble him. You put his arms and legs back on. The testing phase is all about putting yourself back together after being worn down by the depression stage. Going back to the 1940s for a second, it kinda reminds me of Pinocchio becoming a real boy.
I'm a real boy!
You are a real boy!
If the 2010s depression phase was where we lost our humanity, the testing stage is where we regain it. Much like how the bargaining stage was in a way a second denial, the testing stage is akin to a second bargaining. Since you were unable to take the easy way out in the bargaining stage, you need a new way out. This time, it is the hard way out, the thing that you did not want to do. It should be noted that a lot of people don't really make it to this point individually. Most stay in denial, many remain in anger, some continue to bargain, and a few get lost in depression. Needless to say, most people on an individual level are not willing to do the difficult task that the testing stage puts forth. But I still think that the broader zeitgeist of the 2020s is the testing phase. You can feel it in the air, so to speak. And regardless of their individual disposition, these people still ultimately follow where the broader culture is going. I think that this is also part of the reason that testing stage art has an eclectic array of influences. The testing stage is the exact opposite of the denial era. The denial era of the 80s was a rather homogeneous culture. The testing stage is rather heterogeneous. It has a lot more contrasting ideas and competing factions. So the media of the 2020s is really all over the place and lacks identity. You even see this happening in music, where some people claim that music genres are dying and aren't really a thing anymore. This is because artists nowadays lack that grounded formula of past decades. They can't even defy convention because there has not been any standard convention for some time now. So they can't follow the structure, nor can they rebel against it, because that homogeneous culture no longer exists. What is rock and roll in the 2020s? I couldn't tell you. You can't have a standard rock band like AC/DC, and neither can you have a postmodern deconstruction of rock music like Nirvana.
One more special message to go, then I'm done, and I can go home.
There are no tropes to emulate nor subvert in rock music today. Everything's been said and done. So what you end up with is either forgettable homages to past decades, or musical artists that just play every music genre imaginable and have no core identifiable style because every song they do is different. Examples of this are 100 gecs,
Can't go loco, give me your control.
Kim Dracula.
But baby, I would still choose.
And Poppy.
The best bang since the big one. Ooh, heavy. Keep telling yourself that you've been playing nice and go back for forgiveness from Jesus the Christ.
The testing era is paradoxically defined by its inability to be defined. That is why the multiverse is so fitting. It is a genre of fiction that allows one to explore multiple realities simultaneously. The strength of this is that it allows you to look beyond your own limited perspective. Society has a narrative that is imposed by the power structure, and the idea of the multiverse shows you other possible timelines, other potential worldviews. What if Japan had won World War II instead of America? You would have been subjected to a completely different narrative. We tend to believe that the narrative we've been told is the definitive truth, but it's ultimately just a story that we all agree upon. Or if you don't agree with it, it will be imposed on you, as this narrative is enforced. However, in the 2020s, it would seem the narrative has lost its power. The idea that America is the land of freedom and the pursuit of happiness is a myth that is becoming more and more difficult to maintain. Perhaps there will be some sort of event analogous to the fall of the Berlin Wall for America. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the current regime of the USA could similarly fall out of relevance. We are entering a new era. I won't pretend to know what will come next, but we are in a time where we will move from one world to another, just like how multiverses jump from one universe to another. This is why the testing stage is a positive charge decade, as it is proposing a new idea or even multiple options. The following stage, acceptance, is negative charged, as it will shoot down all these varied options and send us down a particular path. Only one of these worldviews will prevail, and we will have to accept the victor as the new ruling power. This is why, despite having a positive charge, testing may not be quite as fun as denial or even bargaining. There will be actual stakes this time around. Everything is turned upside down. The ones you thought were rebels are the ultimate conformists. The ones you thought were heroes turned out to be the most vile of villains. The ones you thought were crazy now seem like the most sane people. Your perception of reality is shattering. It is much akin to the breaking free from the Matrix theme of the 90s anger era. However, it's even beyond that. It's more like a matrix within the matrix. And to demonstrate the difference between anger and testing, I will contrast and compare The Matrix with one of the best works of fiction from the previous testing era, 1984 by George Orwell from 1949. In The Matrix, Neo joins a resistance, and they win in the end. In 1984, Winston joins a resistance, and it turns out that the resistance itself is a fabrication designed by the very people that they were rebelling against, and Winston is completely defeated as a result. This is what I mean by Matrix within the Matrix. You cannot roleplay the rebel or the hero in the testing stage. You will just be a useful idiot for the regime. In the testing stage, you will be tested. If you are a true rebel or a genuine hero, that will be put to the test. However, it will likely feel less like you are Hercules proving his endurance, and more like you are a lab rat being experimented on. You are the guinea pig, and much like Winston from 1984, you will not be the same after this testing has concluded. The testing stage is where one is the most vulnerable. You are completely at the mercy of the world. I mentioned before that bargaining stage art is taboo. Well, if that's the case, then testing stage art is almost heretical. Testing art often reveals such naked vulnerability and weakness. By contrast, the 80s denial art evoked a hyper-masculine image. People are drawn to the strength of Rambo or a Manowar album cover. Then the 2000s bargaining era had a very androgynous quality to it, embracing both the masculine as well as the feminine. Finally, the 2020s testing era has a hyper-feminine energy to it. It's almost as if our entire culture has transitioned from male to female. And I can already hear many lamenting this change. The West has fallen, they say. We need masculinity once again. But I argue, if there is going to be a rebirth of culture, it will be through the feminine. Woman gives birth, both literally and symbolically. It is only through her that a renaissance is possible. Sometimes femininity is a feature, not a bug. So, once we reach the end of this humiliation ritual, once we endure this test, we will reach acceptance. Acceptance may be bittersweet, but at least there will be closure. I suppose I should address the missing link. If the last acceptance stage was the 1950s and the shock stage was the 1970s, where does that place the 1960s? I believe the 60s is what I call the peace stage. Beyond acceptance, peace isn't just accepting the loss, but making peace with it. Peace is perhaps the healthiest stage to be at. Then, of course, the rug is pulled out from underneath, inducing shock once again. So, if the 2020s is testing, the 2030s is acceptance, 2040s is peace, and then the 2050s will be the next shock stage, and we will start all over. So to end this series on a positive note, we seem to have the decades of acceptance and peace ahead of us. It's all uphill from here. It's a steep incline and difficult to climb, but things are at least looking up. Maybe we can't win.
The fight will never win, and time again we try.
We may never stop grieving, but we can find fulfillment in the process of life, regardless. Our acculturation continues.
Take me back to the place where we began.
If you don't pull me out of this swamp of boredom, I'm going to do something drastic.
I have stated that each decade is a stage of grief, and that we are currently in the testing stage of the 2020s, which resides between the depression stage of the 2010s and the acceptance stage of the 2030s. But what will acceptance look like? What trends do I foresee in the pop culture of the following decade? Well, first, I will go over another way of looking at these decades. One that involves age and gender. And please don't take this too literally and take offense. This is my interpretation of these decades, not a condemnation nor an endorsement of them. So, the 70s has an old man theme. Take a look at the fashion, listen to the music, and just observe the pop culture in general. You can say that this is just vibes, and so be it, but nevertheless, the 70s had this old man vibe. Continuing on from this, the 80s had a young man vibe, the 90s had a teenage boy energy, the 2000s had the creativity of childhood, The 2010s was a moody teenage girl, and the 2020s is akin to a young adult woman. Using musicians to summarize this change, we've gone from Lemmy to Sabrina Carpenter.
Think about me every night, oh, isn't that sweet? I guess so.
That's how much the vibe has shifted over the past half a century, and this cycle has repeated throughout history. The previous testing phase was the 1940s and is very comparable to the 2020s, as they are both eras with a young woman vibe. The 1940s is famous for its pinup models, women painted on airplanes, and even where that infamous and iconic "We Can Do It" poster comes from. The previous acceptance phase was the 1950s, so the 2030s may be a parallel to this era. The 2030s will have an old woman vibe, much like the 50s. Another way to think of this is the pagan concept of the triple goddess, the maiden, the mother, and the crone. The 2010s was the maiden, the younger girl prone to depression. This also explains some of the immaturity associated with this decade, and also why this era is introspective and self-centered. The 2020s is the mother, the young adult woman who is more outward focused and a bit more mature. This fits the testing theme, as she is testing solutions and also being tested by reality herself. It also fits that this stage is the mother, as it gives birth to a new world. The 1940s gave birth to the world we all know today. However, that consensus has reached its endpoint, and now, in the 2020s, something new will be born that will likely linger for the next 80 years, ending in the next testing era, which would be the 2100s. Finally, the 2030s will be the crone stage, the wise old woman.
There's no hope for him now. He's suffering. You know we've got to do it.
It's fitting that this era will be acceptance, as the wise old woman resigns herself, accepts life as it is, and gradually makes peace with it. I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. I think that the pop culture of the 2030s is gonna seem pretty lame and boring to most people. I don't really foresee any sort of artistic renaissance taking place until around the late 2040s. I think that the movies of the 2030s will be primarily sentimental soap opera type dramas, and that the video games of the next decade will likely be much the same. Video games will be interactive soap operas. As for music, I think it will be as tame as can be and completely lack any aggression or vigor. I hate to say this as a metalhead, but I really don't think there will be any new metal music in the 2030s. Sure, some bands and genres will be grandfathered in, but there won't be anything new or groundbreaking. I think the art of the 2030s will be kitsch, and it will be kitsch unironically. It will be safe and generic, wholesome entertainment. I predict there will be a decrease in political polarization. However, there will be an increase in censorship. Mainstream art and entertainment will be much more uniform. The messaging will be more agreeable to the average Joe than the polarizing entertainment of the 2010s and 2020s, but the messaging will also be more generic. I predict that the culture of the 2030s will be the exact opposite of the 1990s. Instead of provocative and rebellious art that is intended to disgust, outrage, or offend, the art of the 2030s will preach common sense platitudes in an earnest yet inoffensive way, much like a PSA from the 1950s. In the 2030s, people will be watching soap operas that take place during the Ukraine war and listening to music that more closely resembles Etta James'
My lonely days are over
and Buddy Holly than Nirvana or Pantera. anything remotely edgy will be phased out of the mainstream and relegated to the fringes. I predict that video games in the next decade, when we get to the PlayStation 6 era, will have barely any interactivity at all. It'll be even more like watching a movie than video games already are. Of course, I'm speaking of the mainstream. There will always be indie video games and underground music, but the pop culture at large will be sterile and lacking originality. I know this is a rather bleak picture and not what anyone wants to hear, but I'm just being honest. I would be absolutely thrilled if I am completely wrong about all of this and an artistic renaissance was just around the corner, but I really don't think that's the case. And I can already foresee people saying I'm just being a buzzkill about this. After all, every generation thinks that the generation after them is lame. That is true. And I will admit that I have a fondness and bias for the early 2000s, and as of late I've even been having nostalgia for the 2010s, which for me has been a surreal experience. Maybe the next generation will just say, "Okay, Zoomer," to me, and maybe the pop culture of the 2030s won't be quite as boring as I anticipate, but I am very skeptical. I do think there will be some gems in the next decade, don't get me wrong, but they will be few and far between, and probably not in the mainstream. Throughout my Stages of Grief series, I have been discussing American culture and its decline. I think in the 2030s, this culture of the baby boomers will come to an end. The worship of the 1980s will fade away. The mythos around World War II will no longer have sway with people, and all the pop culture icons that are universally known will die off with Gen X. Cyndi Lauper and Back to the Future will only be known by the older people, and all the pop culture references in The Simpsons and Family Guy will be so alien to Generation Alpha that they might as well be ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Acceptance is about coming to terms with loss. And in the 2030s, we will come to accept the loss of the world of the baby boomers. We will come to accept that most of us will never become rock stars or live in a John Hughes type house. And we won't even be pissed off about it in a Fight Club sort of way. We will just say, it is what it is. Of course, America itself will still exist. But the American dream will be so obsolete as a concept that it could be rightly compared to manifest destiny or the divine right of kings. America will be less comparable to its Statue of Liberty and more akin to the statue of Ozymandias buried in the sand. And there will be a new myth that replaces both the American dream as well as the mythos of World War II. I believe this new myth will be formed in the 2020s and solidified in the 2030s, which means there will have to be a new bad guy. For the past 80 years or so, the bad guy has been the Germans, but that story has run out of steam, and people are looking for a new punching bag. I think it's possible that the Americans will become the new bad guys. It's funny I say this, as last year, when I made my Stages of Grief series, America sort of fell into that villain role, and I was apparently ahead of the curve, as I am Canadian, and I've noticed a massive shift towards Canadian nationalism in my country since 2025 began. And sure, Canadians have always talked trash about America, but before, it was much more superficial. It was more like playful banter between two bros who like different sports teams. In 2025, however, the hate that Canadians have for America seems much more real, and the rest of the world doesn't seem to care for America very much either. When I was criticizing America in my earlier Stages of Grief videos, especially the 80s one, I thought I was being pretty controversial. But I now think this anti-American sentiment is actually pretty safe to express. I think it's quite possible that the current iteration of America will be considered the new evil for the next 80 years. And note that when I say this, I'm not necessarily saying this should happen, it's just a guess at what will happen. People may laugh at the notion of this happening. This upcoming new propaganda is unlikely to persuade you or your generation. But what about your children or your grandchildren? When they grow up hearing stories of some deranged guy who threatened to invade Canada and take over Greenland. This is, of course, just one possibility. America may not be tomorrow's villain, but we can say for sure they will not be tomorrow's hero. The 2030s will be the final decade where the American boomer worldview has any traction on the global scale. Pop culture will stagnate as we await a new order to establish itself. Our acculturation continues.
It won't be long till happiness themselves.
For the conclusion of this series, it only makes sense that I make a video on the only stage I have left to discuss. I began this series starting with the 1970s and have covered every other decade up to the present day, and I even made speculations on the future by comparing the 2030s to the 1950s. But if the 50s is acceptance and the 70s is the shock that resets the cycle, what defines the moment in between? This is the 1960s peace stage. And I believe it's possible that the 2040s will mirror this era in many ways. The peace stage is arguably the only stage of grief that isn't a stage at all, as it is post-grief. After the begrudging acceptance stage, you finally make peace. You overcome grief. Now, knowing that a new shock will eventually ruin this peace may seem like a contradiction, but that's just how tranquil the peace stage is. You can even make peace with the fact that the peace will end. You can make peace with the reality that you will endure each and every stage of grief all over again. That is making peace with life. In some sense, this might be the height of human consciousness, the best place to be in the cycle. You can see why I'd compare this vibe with the 1960s. Not only do people associate the 60s with abundant peace signs and an anti-war zeitgeist, but people also associate the 60s with mind-altering drugs and trying to reach higher states of consciousness. Even in more mundane matters, it seems like the family life was cozy and that people were generally the most happy during this time. I'm not saying that the 60s was perfect or some utopia, but compared to the many decades before and after, the 60s seems pretty idyllic. In the previous installment, I mentioned that each decade has a masculine or a feminine vibe, and a quality of either being youthful or elderly. The peace era seems to transcend this, almost sort of being a combination of all of these simultaneously. It's a unity of the sexes and has both the wisdom of the old and the innocence of youth. I'd say the peace era juxtaposes most interestingly with the bargaining stage, as they are opposite ends of the cycle, yet both have childlike whimsy. But whereas bargaining is the child alone, severed from connection, peace is the cohesive family unit. The child is integrated into a larger network. One in the bargaining era is left to their own devices, sometimes literally, and that era is known for its escapism. It's also more individualistic, and this lack of community leads to anxiety and uncertainty, which goes hand in hand with that escapism. One distracts themselves by playing games or buying stuff to fill the void. Someone in the peace era is quite the opposite. They are more integrated into the larger community. This goes hand in hand with my idea of art and entertainment becoming more boring, safe, and wholesome in the acceptance and peace eras, as one has less need for escapism. There is a saying that all great art comes from suffering, and if that is true, it follows that times without great suffering would also have less great art. While it's a bummer that entertainment will become somewhat irrelevant, it should be some consolation that this boringness will coincide with people becoming more content with life overall. So that is the silver lining. Would you rather have a healthy and stable society, or a society that has Dark Souls 11? Now my more contrarian and Nietzschean side of myself might play devil's advocate and say that I'd personally prefer a time of greater suffering that pushes us to make more interesting works of art. But I think it's pretty obvious that most people, when push comes to shove, would choose stability and happiness over an artistic renaissance, especially if that artistic renaissance also meant living in times of great peril and strife. Now some of you might be wondering, wait a minute, Occulturation, doesn't this whole series debunk the American dream? How can you say that, and then say that in 15 years, we're gonna live in the 1960s 2.0? Isn't that a contradiction? For the record, I do think the American dream is in fact dead. I don't think that 1960s prosperity will ever come back, but that doesn't mean that the peace vibe won't return. It won't be identical with the 1960s, but it will rhyme with it. Some people took issue with me saying the 2010s was the Depression stage and comparing it to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Since sitting in an apartment full of pop figures doesn't quite evoke the same imagery as train hopping in the Dust Bowl, but the technological differences of these two eras are quite vast. Even with the same theme, decades 80 years apart cannot be identical. They can only rhyme. The 2040s can't be a carbon copy of the 1960s, but it can still mimic it in significant ways. I believe that community will come back in a major way in the 2040s. Going back to the bargaining of the early 2000s for a moment, it was the beginning of YouTube. And when YouTube began, their motto was broadcast yourself. It was all about the individual. Today, this is no longer the case. Social media is all about various communities, but these communities are quite polarized and at odds with one another. In 20 years, we've gone from self-centered creativity to warring factions purity spiraling online. So while we've gone from individualism to collectivism, we also live in divisive times. In another 20 years, I suspect that the internet will become a much more cohesive and less adversarial place that's much more unified. Of course, this means the internet will become much more censored and boring overall, but that's the trade-off. Some people will abandon the internet en masse in some sort of Luddite movement, and others will use the internet like mind-altering drugs to attain higher awareness and alter their consciousness. Maybe virtual reality will finally take off for real this time in the 2040s, and there will be a technological equivalent to acid trips. Maybe even something like Facebook's metaverse could take off in the 2040s. We are just in too divisive times for something like that to appeal to people at the moment. As far as other entertainment is concerned, I think the 2040s will be ground zero for the following 80 years of pop culture succeeding it. The 1960s is where classic rock music emerged. Movies by visionary directors became more mainstream, and color television was introduced to the masses. It was the beginning of the boomer American popular culture that really exploded in the 70s. And much like the explosive transition from black and white to color TV, I think there will be similar events in the 2040s. Generation Alpha, or maybe Beta, will be the first generation to grow up in this new cultural paradigm, much like how the Boomers were the first generation raised on rock and roll and television. People may have thought I was just being a depressing doomer in my 2030s acceptance video, but believe it or not, I do possess some degree of optimism for pop culture in the future. I do believe the 2040s will be a new beginning, a new era of pop culture. And remember, the stages and decades bleed together. So yeah, there will still be some developments in the 2030s as well, much like how the beginnings of rock and roll happened in the 1950s. I just think that the cultural output of the 2030s overall will pale in comparison to the decades that come after it. Some people seem to be strawmanning my last video by saying I'm implying there will be absolutely no good art or entertainment in the 2030s at all, which isn't true. I just think that the cultural output of the 2030s will seem lackluster compared to what comes both before and after it. But I'm very much looking forward to the 2040s. I know that it's mostly instinct, and people will say I'm just coping and going off of vibes, and that's what everyone is ultimately doing, whether they acknowledge it or not. But I foresee great things in the 2040s. So let's compare this upcoming decade to the 1960s and see why I think that it's the most pleasant place to be in the entire cycle. We'll start with music. I'll briefly talk about 3 songs I feel exemplify the peace vibe. First, Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head by BJ Thomas.
Raindrops are falling on my head.
This really evokes a peace vibe to me. He's saying no matter what happens, he won't let it get him down.
Nothing's worrying me.
He refers to seeing red.
Doesn't mean my eyes will soon be turning red.
And the blues.
The blues they send to meet me won't defeat me.
Which are more or less akin to anger and depression, respectively, and that he won't give in to either of them.
I'm never gonna stop the rain by complaining.
Second, That's Life by Frank Sinatra.
That's life.
The title alone evokes the theme of peace, or at the very least, acceptance.
This fine old world, it keeps spinning around.
And much like the last song, it's about acknowledging problems and setbacks, but not letting them bother you.
But I don't let it get me down.
Third, Break On Through to the Other Side by The Doors.
Try to run, try to hide.
The Doors are named after the Aldous Huxley book, The Doors of Perception, where Huxley himself is a test subject for various drugs, and The Doors, as a band, are associated with similar themes. But with my theory in mind, I like to think of this track as breaking through to the next cycle, leaving peace behind and embracing the next shock era.
Break on through to the other side.
The peace era is all about letting the chips fall where they may, going with the flow.
Oh, yeah!
As for movies and television, one trend that I've noticed in the 1960s is that movies from this era have very low stakes that are comedically exaggerated. It's not that there isn't any conflict in these films, but it's usually pretty trivial. Instead of being life or death large-scale conflicts like war or an ultimate battle between good and evil, the plots in 60s movies are often about a petty feud over money or a sports game. For example, I watched a 60s film called Blackbeard's Ghost, and the movie was about Blackbeard helping a school's coach to get his team to win.
Come join the Moody Stones, lad! We'll raise your bitty spirits!
The stories in 60s movies are trivial and quaint. By contrast, 2000s bargaining era movies are very large scale and high stakes. 1960s peace era movies have extremely minor problems, which on one hand might make them seem dull and uninteresting, but also make 60s movies quite cute and wholesome. Another couple examples of 60s movies with low stakes yet exaggerated plots are It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, where a bunch of travelers are trying to find someone's buried money, and things get pretty ridiculous. And Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Which, despite in theory sounding like it's high stakes, as it is a Cold War-themed movie, the entire film could not treat this premise more casually.
He ordered his planes to attack your country. Well, let me finish, Dmitri.
It mostly consists of petty bureaucracy and people bickering in a boardroom. Even with the potential of nuclear Armageddon on the horizon, the 60s can't be bothered to get too stirred up about it. The part of the title, How I Learned to Stop Worrying, basically sums up the peace era in a nutshell. I want to address a potential misconception about this series. I'm not saying that the 2040s is going to be all sunshine and rainbows. This series is more about people's reactions to life rather than the actual reality on the ground. As I already touched on, the 1960s was during the Cold War, but the Cold War took place over several decades. In the following disbelief of the shock and denial eras, the outlook was quite different. The 1980s attitude towards the Cold War was a puffed-up chest, patriotism, and an itching for a fight. The 1960s peace stage, by contrast, has a much more relaxed worldview. The 60s outlook is, if we're all gonna die in a mushroom cloud explosion, why worry about it? Just live your life normally, and whatever happens, happens. This is quite different than today's outlook as well, where everyone seems to be trembling under their desks, anticipating the end of the world. The 2020s testing stage reaction to a supposed impending doom seems to be crying in the fetal position. Some people may say I'm just coping here by saying it's gonna get better and everything is gonna be utopian eventually, but I genuinely have no idea if things are gonna get better or not. Potentially, things could get even worse. However, my prediction is not that things will necessarily get better, but rather that people will be better adapted to cope with life as it is than they do now. There's a quote from early 60s US President John F. Kennedy that goes like this: "Do not pray for easier lives. Pray to be stronger men." I think this mindset is in line with the 60s zeitgeist more than any other decade, especially if you compare it to the 90s anger that wants change for the future, the hedonistic escapism of the early 2000s bargaining, or the nostalgic reverence for the past that occupies the 2010s depression phase. The peace era does not long for a better tomorrow, nor a romanticized past. The peace era does not long for escape. The peace era embraces the present and is present for it. There is a famous scene in Lord of the Rings where Frodo expresses that he wishes things had not happened the way they have.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
And Gandalf basically says, "Too bad, deal with it, lol."
So do all who live to see such time, but that is not for them to decide.
And that we don't have much control over things, and should more or less be okay with that, and only focus on the small things we do have power over.
All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us.
Both Frodo and Gandalf have childlike whimsy, but have very different outlooks on life. Frodo best represents the bargaining stage. He finds life rather burdensome and longs for escape, as he uses the ring to turn invisible and quite literally hide from his problems. And of course, the Lord of the Rings movies are bargaining era art, so it makes sense that the protagonist reflects that. Gandalf, however, better represents the peace era. He is not burdened by the grief Frodo possesses, and can make peace with life as it is. Frodo wishes for an easier life, whereas Gandalf tries to be a stronger person. The main distinction being that Gandalf does not long for an escape.
We will go through the mines.
So be it.
If one truly wishes to achieve peace, they must reject all the temptations of the otherworldly. The good old days are never coming back, and the fan fictions of a better tomorrow will never be actualized. The present is all that matters. Now, when I say all this, I'm not saying all of this is entirely in people's heads. This quite obviously does have some impact on the reality on the ground. But ultimately, it all stems from mental states. Imagine two materially identical nations, both with equal wealth and technology, and everything else essentially the same. Now, one of these societies is full of people who are generally content with life, and the other is entirely populated by depressed people. Now, everything else being equal, which society would you rather live in? Chances are you choose the former over the latter, because other people's mental states can still negatively affect you, even if you live in a technologically advanced and wealthy nation. Now, things become much more complicated if you ask the question, would you rather live in an impoverished place populated by people content with life, or a wealthy place populated by people who are depressed? That is a harder question to answer, and I think this idea also explains generational resentments and confusion. There are some older people who grew up in worse economic situations than their children, and they are surprised when younger people are depressed, despite having grown up in better economic conditions than they did. But wealth and technology are not the only factors. The older person likely grew up in times where there was greater community and people were generally better equipped to deal with life. The younger person, on the other hand, grew up more isolated and atomized amongst a bunch of mentally ill peers and often mentally degrading older people around them as well, all of whom are not equipped to deal with the current pressures of life. Unfortunately, having the latest gaming console or a college fund does not magically remedy these issues. When you live in times when the average young person is prone to mental breakdowns, and the average older person is increasingly more and more out of touch with the youth, this is a recipe for dissatisfaction with life. This causes a feedback loop where people become more mentally unstable over time due to entropy, and this also makes life more unpleasant overall for everyone. However, the good news is, I suspect we've already surpassed the worst of this. I think the mass hysteria around 2020 was the peak of this phenomenon. I think people will begin to become more mentally stable going forward. I think millennials and Zoomers will have a greater understanding of the upcoming generation's issues than boomers and Gen X do. And I also think that Generation Alpha and Beta will grow up being much more mentally stable than millennials and Zoomers were. Throughout this series, I have compared each decade to a genre of fiction. I will recap. The 70s was sci-fi. The 80s was fantasy. The 90s was like action movies. The early 2000s was superhero and comic book media. The 2010s was post-apocalypse/zombie media, and the 2020s is the multiverse, as well as a collage and compilation of all the previous decades. As for the 2030s, I didn't outright say it, more so just implied it, but I think the soap opera will sum up the acceptance era. I think media will become much more melodramatic, and this melodrama also applies to the previous acceptance phase as well, the 1950s. As for what genre of fiction will best suit the 2040s, I'd say it'll be comedy, specifically lighthearted and slapstick type of comedy, wholesome and G-rated comedy, as opposed to the more juvenile and raunchy R-rated humor of the early 2000s. Comedy was the theme of the 1960s. It is by far the most lighthearted theme of all the decades, and that reflects the peace era quite well. It is quite carefree and childlike. Bargaining era art has the vibe that it is made by kids, and peace era art seems more like it is made for kids. The entertainment of the bargaining stage is crude, outlandish, and tends to get rather dark out of nowhere. But peace era entertainment feels more like it is curated by parents to be child-friendly. Bargaining is playing pretend in your backyard, and peace is summer camp. So while both share a childish charm, they are also opposites in some respects. It's funny I've gotten so much criticism for comparing the decades to masculinity and femininity respectively. Some people seem to think I am bashing femininity by implying the better times were the more masculine eras, and others seem to think I'm bashing masculinity by downplaying its value and not being super critical of the feminization of culture. But if anything, this series is implying that the childish stages are superior to both the masculine and feminine stages. I've already said that I consider the bargaining stage of the early 2000s to be my personal favorite era, and I'm saying here that the peace era is a desirable end goal. I'm not here to bash either femininity nor masculinity. I actually think the highest points of the cycle are the ones that have a healthy balance of both of the sexes. Both femininity and masculinity in isolation can have many flaws, and while there is merit to both sexes as well as their eras, I do believe the bargaining and peace stages are the height of human creativity and flourishing. Interestingly, this is somewhat reflected in Nietzsche's three metamorphoses, which are the camel, the lion, and the child. The camel represents carrying the baggage of other people, adopting their values and adhering to their dogma, being an obedient follower. The lion stage is much the opposite, being adversarial and deconstructing that dogma, challenging everything. The issue with this is that it can only destroy and does not create, and thus it leads to nihilism. The child stage is where one creates anew and does not sheepishly follow dogma nor nihilistically reject everything, but instead builds their own values. Very interesting choice to have the child represent the highest point of human consciousness, as it runs contrary to our more common sense notions that we must grow up and leave childish things behind. But are the people who hold such notions well-rounded and mature people? No. On the contrary, they tend to be rather bitter, angry, and depressed people. And that alone speaks volumes. Their hostility to childishness is not coming from a place of maturity. In fact, if you look at the teenage stages of anger and depression, they are much like the lion stage, nihilistically deconstructing everything. And if you look at the adult stages of denial and testing, they are more like the camel stage, bearing the weight of responsibility and dogma and telling themselves everything is fine, or that everything will be okay, and needing these sentiments to be true in order to not have a complete mental breakdown. Paradoxically, the ones who are the most mature are the ones who embrace some sense of childishness rather than rejecting it as if they are above it. What's interesting is that the three metamorphoses concept was from Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, a book from the 1880s. Now, if you recall, I mentioned in the 2020s video that the previous shock stage was the 1890s, which would make the 1880s a former peace stage. So Thus Spake Zarathustra could potentially be a peace era work of art. Another thinker I'm drawn to is Marshall McLuhan, famous for The Medium is the Message. His thinking parallels mine as well, as he views the medium itself as saying more than the content that it holds. You could boil down my own series to the concept, the decade is the message, as I'm essentially saying that regardless of whatever message a piece of media is trying to get across, what is far more telling is what is shown, not told. The time and place of a work of art often speaks more volumes than the intent of the author, which I know may upset some of those who are artistically inclined. But I don't say this to diminish the role of artists, nor to devalue art. I think that art is of the utmost importance. I myself am not immune to this rule either. My entire Stages of Cultural Grief series itself is a testing work of art. It is a collage of all the past decades and explores the multiverse of possibilities. It is just another example of 2020's media. I find it very interesting that these two thinkers I seem to admire, and who have possibly influenced me the most, seem to represent the two former peace eras of the 1880s and 1960s respectively. I sincerely hope that I am still creating stuff in the 2040s, as I have a hunch that might be my time to shine. To end this massive series on a positive note, no matter what regime we end up living under, no matter what tragedy may befall us, no matter what conditions we have to survive through, life will go on. Art will continue to be created. Our stories will be told, even if indirectly. I genuinely think the best is yet to come. I do think the worst will be behind us, and life will get better. Even if it doesn't, we will be much stronger and better equipped to deal with whatever challenges await us. And if AI destroys us all and the nukes go off, let it happen while I play a beloved video game and listen to my favorite tunes, not huddled up in a corner crying about World War III on Twitter. Our acculturation continues.
No one